Senator John Neely Kennedy and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just collided in a United States Senate hearing room, and a $93 trillion political fantasy was completely dismantled by a 71-year-old man holding nothing but a yellow legal pad and a pocket calculator. Hit that like button and subscribe right now, because in the next 43 minutes, you are going to hear the exact, unfiltered story of how the most televised progressive icon in modern American history was forced into absolute trembling silence by a country lawyer who simply asked her to do the math. This plan will pay for itself, and quite frankly, anyone who is asking how we fund the salvation of our planet is simply running cover for corporate greed. Those words were spoken into a federal microphone on a crisp Tuesday morning in the nation's capital. The representative who spoke them read them seamlessly from the glowing screen of a brand new silver iPad Pro. She spoke them to forcefully defend a massive climate and economic overhaul, a legislative package with a staggering, almost incomprehensible price tag of $93 trillion. She did not tell the public in that precise moment that behind the soaring television rhetoric, behind the focus group tested buzzwords, and behind the moral grandstanding, the actual economic ledger was completely and utterly empty. The representative speaking was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. 26 minutes earlier, long before the viral clips would be cut, edited, and sent burning through social media algorithms, a very different kind of politician had walked through the towering, heavy oak doors of hearing room 216 inches, the Hart Senate office building. The air inside the room was already thick with the familiar, suffocating electricity of a high-stakes Washington spectacle, filled with reporters, lobbyists, and political aides whispering furiously. But he moved through the crowd with the unhurried, deliberate pace of a man walking into a local parish hall on a Sunday morning. He was a silver-haired senator from the Deep South, a man who had built a quiet but formidable career not on viral internet moments, manufactured partisan outrage, or carefully curated digital brands, but on the unforgiving, cold reality of state budgets. He did not bring a sleek silver tablet to the witness table. He did not bring a lightweight laptop plastered with campaign stickers. He did not have a small army of highly paid, Ivy League-educated political consultants trailing anxiously behind him, clutching glossy presentation folders, digital slide decks, and thick binders full of focus group-tested talking points. He brought one single, solitary item, a yellow legal pad. It was dog-eared at the bottom right corner, a standard-issue, narrow-ruled pad with faint blue lines and a red margin, the exact kind you can buy in a shrink-wrapped 3-pack at any local office supply store, pharmacy, or supermarket in America. The cardboard backing was slightly bent from use. He had carried it with him on his commercial flight from New Orleans to Washington, D.C. the night before. While other politicians might have spent that 2-hour flight conferring with media strategists over Wi-Fi or reviewing polling data on their glowing screens, he had sat under the dim, yellow glow of the overhead cabin light, his plastic tray table folded down. On that simple, inexpensive paper, written in his own tight, cursive handwriting, lay the basic, undeniable mathematical realities of the policies being proposed by the woman now sitting across the witness table. He had done the arithmetic himself, carrying the ones, crossing the zeros, and methodically mapping out the devastating economic toll of a utopian dream. He brought no renowned prize-winning economists from coastal universities to testify on his behalf. He did not bring think tank scholars to cite complex macroeconomic theories. He did not need any. The numbers, he knew, required no academic translation for the working people of his state. Across the vast, polished mahogany of the committee witness table, Senator John Neely Kennedy looked directly at Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He peered silently over the top of his wire-rimmed reading glasses, his weathered hands folded neatly over his yellow pad. As she began her opening statement, he did not interrupt her. He did not sigh heavily into the microphone. He did not scoff. He did not interrupt with parliamentary inquiries. And he did not roll his eyes for the benefit of the press cameras flashing rapidly in the center aisle. He just let her finish. It was the calculated, icy patience of a seasoned country lawyer a man who had spent decades in Southern courtrooms and knew that the most fatal trap you can set for an overly confident witness is simply giving them enough uninterrupted time to speak. When she finally took a breath, bringing her passionate monologue to a close, his voice broke the heavy silence of the room. It was a slow, deliberate Louisiana drawl, a deceptive, folksy cadence that perfectly masked a razor-sharp legal and financial mind. It was the voice of a man who knows exactly what the final verdict is going to be long before the trial even starts. The hearing was officially titled Evaluating Long-Term Economic Impacts of Environmental Legislation, a dry, bureaucratic name that completely masked the historic ideological collision about to take place. 5.2 million Americans were watching the live broadcast at that very second. They were watching from worn couches in their living rooms, glancing up at televisions mounted behind sticky diner counters in Ohio, and squinting at their phone screens while sitting in pickup trucks during their brief lunch breaks in Texas, Pennsylvania, and Louisiana. These were people already feeling the squeeze of inflation, waiting with bated breath to hear what Washington was going to cost them next. Representative Ocasio-Cortez sat under the bright, unforgiving glare of the committee lights wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored white blazer, her signature red lipstick perfectly applied. She was completely, undeniably in her element. She had just spent 5 full, uninterrupted minutes delivering a rapid-fire, deeply impassioned monologue. She spoke of existential global threats, of deeply rooted systemic inequalities, and of the absolute unquestionable moral imperative of authorizing massive, unprecedented levels of government spending to reshape the entire American economy. Her delivery was flawless, her tone urgent, commanding, and heavily practiced. She spoke with the absolute, unshakable certainty of someone who is entirely accustomed to receiving thunderous standing ovations from late-night television hosts, glowing praise from elite coastal editorial boards, and adoring glossy magazine profiles. In her world, the sweeping moral vision was always enough. The noble intentions always justified the final price tag. But in that hearing room on a Tuesday morning, sitting across from a 71-year-old man holding a 79-cent notepad, her sweeping rhetoric was about to violently collide with the unbreakable laws of basic mathematics. When the final impassioned echoes of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's opening statement finally faded into the high vaulted ceilings of hearing room 216, the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, expectant, and charged with the crackling electricity of a high-stakes ideological collision. The flashing bulbs of the press photographers in the center aisle cast rapid, lightning-like shadows against the ornate wood paneling. The entire room, the lobbyists in their tailored suits, the young congressional aides clutching thick binders, and the seasoned journalists tapping furiously on their laptops collectively held its breath, waiting to see how the veteran from the Deep South would respond to the progressive titan of the modern left. When it was Senator John Neely Kennedy's turn to speak, he did not rush to fill the quiet. He was a man who understood that in the theater of Washington politics, a strategically deployed silence could be far more devastating than a shouted interruption. He took his time. His movements were slow, methodical, and entirely unbothered by the frantic, rapid-fire pacing of the modern media cycle. He reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal gray suit jacket and pulled out a simple plastic blue ballpoint pen. He held it for a fraction of a second, his thumb resting over the top, and then he clicked it once. The sharp mechanical clack of the pen echoed with startling clarity through the hushed room, sounding less like a writing instrument and more like the cocking of a hammer on a revolver. Representative Kennedy began. His tone was impeccably polite, steeped in the traditional gentlemanly manners of the Southern political establishment, yet underneath that soft velvet exterior was a layer of incredibly firm, unyielding steel. I have read your proposal. He paused, looking down at his dog-eared yellow legal pad before looking back up, his eyes locking onto hers. I have read the glossy executive summary your team put together. I have read the hundreds of pages of legislative text. I have even read the tiny footnotes buried at the bottom of the appendices. And I want you to know, ma'am, that I have spent the better part of my entire weekend sitting alone at my kitchen table down in Louisiana, drinking black coffee, going line by painstaking line through this document. I was trying with all my might to find the single page, the single paragraph, or even the single sentence where you explain to the hardworking, tax-paying American citizen how exactly we as a nation are going to afford a $93 trillion bill. Kennedy leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the mahogany desk. The sheer magnitude of the number seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. I looked hard, ma'am. I looked until my eyes blurred, but I could not find it. It is not there. So I am asking you today in plain, everyday English, not for the economists, but for the folks watching back home right now who have to balance their own checkbooks every Friday night. How exactly are you going to pay for this? Across the witness table, Representative Ocasio-Cortez did not flinch. She leaned forward into her space, a tight, supremely confident half smile forming on her lips, the kind of smile designed to project absolute intellectual superiority. She reached out with a manicured hand and adjusted the neck of her microphone with practiced ease. It was the flawless, involuntary reflex of a seasoned cable news guest who instinctively knows how to frame her face for the tight camera shot. Senator Kennedy, with all due respect to the time you spent reading the bill, she said, her cadence quick, sharp, and flawlessly rhythmic, the words tumbling out in a polished, heavily rehearsed rush. I think the fundamental premise of your question itself reveals a deep structural misunderstanding of modern monetary theory. She did not pause for him to digest the academic terminology. She pressed the attack, utilizing the elite economic vocabulary of the progressive movement. When a sovereign nation issues its own fiat currency, it is simply not constrained by revenues in the exact same way a household or a small business is. The federal government of the United States is not a family sitting around a kitchen table trying to balance a checkbook. That is a false equivalence. The only real macroeconomic constraint on federal spending is inflation. And as long as we are actively investing that capital into productive capacity, such as widespread green infrastructure, renewable energy grids, and systemic equity programs, the plan essentially funds itself over time through generated economic growth. Asking how we pay for it is an outdated 20th century economic framing that serves only one purpose: to halt necessary life-saving environmental progress. In the back rows of the hearing room, the progressive press section murmured in quiet, palpable approval. It was a flawless soundbite, perfectly engineered for evening broadcasts and viral social media clips. Standing in the darkened wings near the heavy oak doors, her communications director nodded vigorously, a look of profound validation washing over his face. They believed she had just intellectually outmaneuvered the old guard. Senator Kennedy, however, did not look defeated. He sat back slowly, letting the heavy leather of his large chair creak audibly under his weight. He did not immediately reach for his microphone. He just let her words, the Ivy League terminology, the macroeconomic theories, the dismissive comparison of the federal government to a family checkbook hang thickly in the air for a long, agonizing moment. He did not look angry. He did not look insulted by her condescension. Instead, he looked faintly amused. It was the exact patient expression a wise grandfather might wear while listening to an overly enthusiastic teenager try to explain the convoluted rules of a complicated video game. Without breaking eye contact with the representative, Kennedy slowly lowered his right hand. He took his simple blue ballpoint pen and made a single, deliberate, deeply etched checkmark on the top line of his cheap, yellow legal pad. The scratch of the ink against the paper was barely audible, but the psychological weight of the gesture was immense. He had anticipated her exact offense. She had walked directly into the trap. Modern monetary theory, Kennedy repeated. He spoke the words incredibly slowly, deliberately dragging out the vowels, letting the multisyllabic academic phrase stretch out and ring hollow across the vast wood-paneled expanse of the Senate room. He then did something entirely unexpected. He stopped looking at Representative Ocasio-Cortez. He turned his head slightly, peering over the top rims of his reading glasses, and looked directly into the glowing red lens of the C-SPAN camera broadcasting the hearing live to the nation. He bypassed the politician entirely and spoke straight to the millions of working-class Americans watching from their living rooms, their factory break rooms, and their diner booths. Representative, I completely understand the academic words you are using today, Kennedy said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant gravel that commanded absolute authority. I am not a stranger to high finance. I had the distinct honor of serving as the state treasurer of Louisiana for nearly 2 decades. For 20 years, I personally managed billions of dollars of the public's hard-earned money. I had to balance the books, pay the state's bills, and ensure our pensions were funded. And during that time, I have read all the thick-bound academic papers written by the brilliant folks up at Harvard and Yale about this modern monetary theory. He paused. It was a long, heavily intentional pause that forced everyone in the cavernous hearing room to hang on his next breath. Slowly, methodically, he leaned slightly closer to his microphone, the metallic bass scraping faintly against the polished mahogany desk. But here is the fundamental problem with your theory, ma'am, he said, his voice shedding its polite senatorial veneer to reveal the raw, unvarnished truth beneath. In the real world and by the real world. I do not mean the faculty lounges of elite universities, and I certainly do not mean the insulated, wealthy bubble of Washington, D.C. I am talking about places like Shreveport, Louisiana, or Omaha, Nebraska, or Grand Rapids, Michigan. In those places, the unforgiving rules of mathematics have not been magically suspended. He gestured with his blue pen, pointing it not at her, but toward the camera. When a hard-working plumber, a man who has been breaking his back, crawling under sinks and fixing pipes for 20 years, goes down to the local Ford dealership on a Saturday morning to buy a new F-150 work truck just to keep his small business afloat, the loan officer at that bank does not sit him down and ask for his brilliant thoughts on modern monetary theory. The bank does not care about fiat currency elasticity. The bank looks at his calloused hands and asks him for a hard cash down payment. The bank asks him to prove, on paper, in undeniable black and white, that he has the actual physical cash flow to make his monthly installments. If he looks at the loan officer and tells the bank that his debt is just a macroeconomic illusion, they show him the door, and he loses his livelihood. Kennedy reached down and picked up his dog-eared yellow legal pad, holding it up slightly so the bright fluorescent lights caught the cheap cardboard backing. It looked entirely out of place in a room filled with gleaming silver tablets and expensive tailored suits. When a tired mother of 3 walks into the local grocery store on a cold Tuesday evening, just trying to feed her family after working an exhausting 8-hour shift, she faces a brutal reality that your academic theories completely ignore. When she pushes her metal cart down the dairy aisle and finds that a single gallon of milk now costs $2 entire more than it did just last year, and a pound of ground beef costs $3 more simply because the federal government decided to fire up the printing presses and flood the economy with money it did not actually have, she has a crisis on her hands. He shook the yellow pad gently for emphasis, the paper rustling in the quiet room. When she gets to the checkout counter and watches that digital register climb higher and higher, she cannot reach into her purse and hand the cashier a 6-page academic thesis on the virtues of fiat currency. She cannot pay the local grocer with a promise of systemic equity. She has to pay the bill with dollars she actually earned. And if she does not have those dollars, because federal inflation has eaten her paycheck alive, then she has to put the milk back on the shelf, and her kids drink water. He set the yellow pad back down on the desk with a soft, definitive thud. The entire hearing room had grown incredibly, suffocatingly quiet. The low murmurs of the progressive press section had vanished completely. The only sound left in the room was the frantic, rapid-fire clicking of cameras from the press pool. The seasoned photographers instinctively sensed the massive atmospheric shift. They were documenting the exact moment a political narrative was breaking in real time. Yet you are sitting here telling the American people today on the permanent public record that the federal government can somehow magically spend $93 trillion, Kennedy continued, his voice dropping into a resonant, booming register that commanded the space. For context, ma'am, for the folks trying to wrap their heads around that figure that is more money than currently exists in the entire global banking system. It is a number so astronomically large, it defies human comprehension. And you are looking straight into that television camera and telling the working taxpayers of this country that nobody actually has to pay for it. You are telling them that a $93 trillion debt is just a phantom, an illusion crafted by cynical conservatives to stop progress. Kennedy slowly shook his silver head, a profound look of disappointment settling into his weathered features. Ma'am, where I come from, we do not fall for that kind of high society double talk. We have a very simple saying down south. If somebody knocks on your front door and tries to sell you a beautiful, sprawling, multi-million-dollar house, but they get highly offended, raise their voice, and flat out refuse to show you the mortgage papers or tell you what the monthly interest rate is going to be, they are not trying to house you. They are getting ready to pick your pocket. Across the mahogany divide, the tight, supremely confident smile on the representative's face finally faltered. It was only for a fraction of a second, a microscopic twitch of the facial muscles, but under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the C-SPAN lights, it was glaringly obvious. The elite, impenetrable academic shield she had so carefully brought into the hearing room had just been completely and utterly bypassed. Her Ivy League vocabulary and focus group-tested talking points were rendered completely useless. Senator Kennedy had deliberately refused to debate her on the complex macroeconomic nuances of her modern monetary theory. He had not engaged with her elite academic jargon. Instead, he had taken her abstract utopian theories and forcefully translated them into the devastating, undeniable, and brutal reality of everyday American life. He had dragged the entire debate out of the wealthy ivory tower and dropped it squarely onto the scratched kitchen table of the American working class. And in that brutal, unforgiving arena, she had absolutely no defense. Senator, she interjected, her voice rising slightly in pitch, the polished, media-ready veneer finally cracking just enough for the frustration beneath to show through. That is a gross oversimplification of macroeconomic policy. We are talking about taxing corporate hoarders who have spent decades hollowing out the middle class. We are talking about closing the labyrinth of loopholes and finally making the ultra-wealthy pay their fair share to fund our collective future. It is about holding the elite accountable for the damage they have done to our social fabric. Kennedy did not rise to the bait. He did not get angry or loud. Instead, he simply held up a single weathered hand, a gesture of quiet authority that stopped her mid-sentence as effectively as a gavel. He reached back down and picked up his simple blue ballpoint pen. We will get to the ultra-wealthy in just a moment, Representative. We surely will, Kennedy said, his voice as calm as a bayou at dawn. He looked down at the second page of his yellow legal pad, his eyes scanning the handwritten rows of data. Because I did some math last night, while the rest of the world was sleeping, on who exactly pays the price when politicians decide to wage a public relations war on corporations. And I want to walk you through that math. Slowly. The silence that settled into hearing room 216 was heavy, thick with the kind of tension that precedes a storm. Kennedy did not rush to fill it. He took his pen and drew a single deliberate and audible line across the yellow page, marking a transition from theory to reality. Representative Kennedy said, his voice dropping a half octave, settling into a low, comfortable, and resonant gravel. You have built your entire political brand, indeed, your entire national profile on being the fearless, uncompromising champion of the working class. You speak frequently, you speak loudly, and you speak passionately on every cable news platform available about fighting for the little guy against the heartless corporate elites. That is correct, Senator, she replied. Her defensive posture returned instantly, her chin lifting in a show of defiance as she stared across the mahogany divide. And I stand proudly by my record of holding corporate monopolies accountable for exploiting marginalized communities and extracting generational wealth from the working class to line the pockets of shareholders. Well then, let us talk about that exact record, Kennedy replied smoothly, his tone shifting into the dangerous territory of a cross-examination. Let us talk specifically about the year 2019, Long Island City, Queens, in the very heart of your own district's backyard. He looked directly at his handwritten notes, tapping the paper with his pen. In 2019, Amazon proposed building their second massive headquarters HQ2 right there in Queens. They didn't just promise a building, ma'am. They promised 25,000 high-paying jobs. And let us be very clear for the folks watching at home, these were not part-time, seasonal, or minimum wage jobs. These were career-defining roles, averaging $150,000 a year in salary. On top of that, they promised $27 billion in state and local tax revenue over the next 2 decades. Revenue, ma'am, that your state could have used to fix your notoriously broken subways, to fund your underperforming public schools, and to repair the crumbling roads that your constituents drive on every single day. He paused, letting the sheer weight of those lost billions sink into the room. He looked directly at her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the surrounding press cameras seem to vanish. You led the political crusade to kill that deal, Kennedy said, the Louisiana drawl now carrying a sharp edge of accusation. You rallied the crowds in the streets. You mobilized the internet. You turned it into a litmus test for progressive purity. And you succeeded. The deal fell apart. Amazon walked away. They took the 25,000 jobs and the $27 billion with them. She leaned toward her microphone, her eyes flashing with a cold, sharp defiance that had made her a star on the political stage. Senator, what we stopped was a multi-billion-dollar corporate giveaway. She shot back, her words hitting like rapid-fire stones. We stopped a sweetheart tax break for one of the richest, most ruthless monopolies on earth, a company that pays zero in federal taxes, while its founder builds space rockets. We protected the local community in Queens from being priced out of their own homes and displaced by rampant, unchecked gentrification. We stood up to Jeff Bezos when no one else would. That, Senator, is exactly what fighting for the working class looks like in the 21st century. Kennedy didn't blink. He sat there, his weathered face an unreadable mask of Southern patience. He had heard the talking points before. He had seen the viral clips, but he wasn't interested in the rhetoric. He was interested in the ledger. Representative Kennedy began again, his voice dropping into that deceptive, quiet hum. I want you to think about the man in Queens who was hoping for a construction job on that site. I want you to think about the woman who wanted to open a small catering business to serve those 25,000 new employees. You told them no so you could say no to a billionaire. You traded their actual physical livelihoods for a symbolic victory on Twitter. He tapped the yellow pad again, the sound sharp in the quiet room. You claim you stood up to Jeff Bezos, but Jeff Bezos is still a billionaire. Amazon is still a monopoly. The only people who actually lost anything in that fight were the people in your district who didn't get those 25,000 paychecks. You didn't hurt the elite, ma'am. You just made sure the little guy didn't get a seat at the table. And that is a very expensive kind of victory for a working class family to have to pay for. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. It was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a narrative being stripped bare. Kennedy leaned back, his blue pen poised over the yellow paper, waiting for her to find a way to make the math work. The cameras stayed on her, catching the slight tightening of her jaw as the $27 billion ghost of HQ2 hovered in the air between them. Kennedy had moved past the slogans, and for the first time in the hearing, the champion of the working class appeared to be struggling to explain why the working class had been left with nothing but a headline. Senator Kennedy did not blink. He sat perfectly still, an unreadable mask of Southern patience, letting her finish the practice talking points that had served her so well on cable news sets and social media clips. Then, with the deliberate gravity of a man about to deliver a closing argument, he leaned forward, the front legs of his chair hitting the carpeted floor with a dull thud. In plain English, Representative Kennedy began, his voice dropping into a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the mahogany witness table. You fought for a symbolic victory on the internet. You fought for a catchy headline and a spike in your social media mentions. And the price of that symbolic victory was paid in full, not by the elites you claim to despise, but by the exact working class people you claim to represent. He extended a weathered finger, tapping the desk with rhythmic, bone-on-wood emphasis. The corporate executives at Amazon did not lose a single dime because of your crusade, ma'am. Jeff Bezos did not miss a single meal. They simply moved their operations, their billions in capital, and their thousands of opportunities elsewhere to a city that actually wanted them. But do you know who actually lost? I will tell you. The union construction workers who were slated to spend 5 years building that massive headquarters, they lost. The local deli owners who were prepared to sell thousands of sandwiches a week to those new employees, they lost. The janitors, the security guards, the plumbers, and the electricians who were looking for a steady paycheck, they lost. You told 25,000 New Yorkers they could not have a better life or a secure future simply because you wanted to prove a political point on cable television. He let that heavy reality sit in the room like a thick fog. In the rows behind the representative, the progressive staffers, young men and women in tailored suits who had spent years crafting this narrative, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly finding reasons to look at their laps rather than the unforgiving lenses of the cameras. But it gets much more confusing to me, ma'am, Kennedy continued, his tone softening into a deceptive, almost grandfatherly gentleness. He slowly turned to page 4 of his yellow legal pad, the sound of the paper rustling like dry leaves. Because if you truly despise the corporate elite so much that you would chase 25,000 generational jobs out of your own city just to spite them, then why on earth did you go to their party? The representative's posture, which had been leaning into the fight, suddenly stiffened into a rigid line. The practiced, confident half-smile she had worn for the last hour vanished completely from her face. In September of 2021, Kennedy read slowly, his voice methodical, as if he were reciting a criminal indictment. You attended the Met Gala in New York City. The tickets for this elite social event, according to public records, cost $35,000 apiece. The tables cost up to $300,000. He paused, looking up over the rims of his glasses. His expression, previously folksy, had turned as icy as a Louisiana winter. Now, my math might be a little rusty, ma'am, but down in Shreveport, Louisiana, $35,000 is more than a single mother makes working 40 hours a week at a local diner for an entire calendar year. And yet, you attended this event surrounded by the wealthiest people on the planet, the billionaires, the tech moguls, the Hollywood elite. And you did it wearing a custom-made designer white gown with the words "Tax the Rich" painted on the back in bright red letters. She reached for her microphone quickly, her movements sharp, the defensive edge in her voice now tight and vibrating with frustration. Senator, my attendance at that event was a deeply strategic decision to bring the message of working-class justice directly into the halls of power. It was about challenging the establishment to their faces, making them uncomfortable in their own spaces, and forcing the conversation where it is usually ignored. The medium is the message. Kennedy shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment settling into his features. The Louisiana drawl thickened, carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of common sense. "No, ma'am," he replied, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The medium is a $35,000 ticket. The medium is imported caviar and expensive champagne. You cannot be the fierce champion of the working class while you are sipping cocktails at a billionaire's masquerade ball. In the real world, ma'am, when people are struggling to pay for gas and groceries, they don't see a strategic message. They see a fashion statement made at their expense." He looked back down at his pad, the scratch of his pen against the paper, the only sound in the suffocating silence. He had moved past the slogans, and for the first time in the hearing, the champion of the working class appeared to be struggling to explain why the working class had been left with nothing but a headline, while she was left with a designer dress. In plain English, Representative Kennedy whispered, "You can't claim to be fighting the machine while you're the one being toasted at its banquet." The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was the silence of a narrative being stripped bare. The cameras stayed on her, catching the slight tightening of her jaw as the $27 billion ghost of the lost Amazon headquarters hovered in the air between them. Kennedy had dragged the debate out of the wealthy ivory tower and dropped it squarely onto the scratched kitchen table of the American working class, and in that arena, the designer gown offered no protection at all. Senator Kennedy looked up one final time, his eyes cold and clear. Math is math, Representative, and hypocrisy is hypocrisy. The folks back home in Louisiana and the folks in Queens who lost those jobs, they know the difference. And they're still waiting for their seat at the table you were so busy enjoying. He set his pen down on the desk. You wore a protest sign as a high-fashion statement while socializing, laughing, and dining with the exact same billionaires you claim are destroying the fabric of this country. You drank their fine wine, you took glamorous pictures with the Hollywood elite, and then you went back to Washington, D.C. to propose a $93 trillion bill that will ultimately bankrupt the truck drivers, the factory workers, and the waitresses who could not even afford to park their cars outside that building. He let the heavy silence do the work. In plain English, Representative, you cannot be the fierce champion of the working class while you are wearing a designer gown at a billionaire's masquerade ball. Both things cannot be true at the same time. You have to pick one. The hearing room was dead quiet. The air felt thick, charged with the kind of tension that only happens when a carefully constructed political narrative is dismantled in real time. Senator Kennedy slowly reached into his suit jacket. He did not pull out a colorful chart. He did not pull out a staff-generated report. He pulled out a small, gray, solar-powered Texas Instruments calculator, the exact kind every high school math student in America has used for decades. He placed it on the mahogany desk, right next to the yellow legal pad. Representative Kennedy said, his voice dropping to a quiet, steady hum that demanded absolute attention. My mother taught me a lot of things growing up. One of the things she used to tell me was, John, I did not raise a fool, and if I did, it was one of your brothers. A few low, nervous chuckles rippled through the press corps, but Kennedy's face remained deadly serious. She also taught me that when somebody tries to sell you a beautiful dream, but they get incredibly angry when you ask to see the price tag, they are getting ready to fleece you. He looked directly into the representative's eyes. So I am going to ask you one final question. I do not want a lecture on modern monetary theory. I do not want to hear a speech about systemic inequality. I want a yes or no answer. He tapped the plastic casing of the Texas Instruments calculator. Under oath, before the United States Senate and before the 5.2 million Americans watching at home right now, can you prove with basic elementary math how you will fund $93 trillion in new government spending without massively raising taxes on the American middle class? Yes or no? The camera zoomed in tightly on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She looked down at her silver iPad Pro. The screen had gone to sleep. It was just a black, empty mirror reflecting the ceiling lights. The first second passed. The second. The third. She looked to her left, toward the gallery. Her communications director was staring firmly at the floor, unwilling to meet her gaze. The fourth. The fifth. She reached for her microphone. Her fingers trembled, just slightly, but enough. The high-definition cameras caught it all. Senator, the framing of that question relies on a fundamentally flawed premise of conservative economics that willfully ignores the existential. Yes or no, Representative? Kennedy interrupted. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be loud to be devastating. $93 trillion. Yes or no? The 6th second ticked by. The 7th. The 8th. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The elite confidence, the rapid-fire debate skills, the cable news bravado, it all completely evaporated in the face of a simple, unavoidable math question asked by a man who flatly refused to play by her media rules. The 9th second, the 10th. She slowly let go of the microphone. She sat back in her large leather chair, her jaw tight, staring in absolute silence at the man across the room. Senator Kennedy nodded once, slowly. He picked up the Texas Instruments calculator and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. He closed his yellow legal pad. Math is math, Representative Kennedy said quietly, the finality of the statement ringing through the room. And it appears you do not have any. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time. The math is entered into the record. The country can review it tonight. The chairman, looking slightly stunned, gave a 30-minute recess. The representative stood up. She gathered her papers slowly, methodically. She did not look at her staff. She walked toward the side door. Kennedy was already walking out the main entrance, his yellow notepad tucked securely under his arm, his pace unhurried. The aftermath came fast, and it was brutal. By noon that day, 4 hashtags had taken the top trending positions on every single American social media platform. The phrases, math is math, 93 trillion, the yellow notepad, and where is the money were everywhere. The 12-second clip of her trembling hand, and by sundown, that single clip had passed 40 million views. Her communications director released a statement late that afternoon. It was 4 pages long. The statement used the word moral 6 times. It used the phrase climate justice 5 times. It used the phrase future generations 8 times. But it did not mention the Amazon jobs. It did not mention the Met Gala ticket. And most importantly, it did not mention the math. That statement, in a way, was the entire problem wrapped up in 4 pages of political spin. The politician who had built a massive, lucrative career on the brand of fighting for the working class had just spent nearly an hour of live television refusing to answer one simple mathematical question about how her policies would actually impact their wallets. This is the reality of the modern political resistance and the elite progressive movement. In a single Wednesday morning, the cable news commentariat, the primetime hosts, and the elite pundits who for years treated this representative as the unquestioned conscience of a new political era watched her narrative completely collapse. They watched the academic theories of modern monetary theory crumble into dust when confronted with the reality of a Louisiana plumber trying to buy a truck. They watched the defense of chasing away 25,000 jobs fall apart under basic scrutiny. They watched the hypocrisy of wearing a protest dress to a billionaire's gala get dragged into the harsh daylight. The political elite did not just betray the working class by proposing policies that drive up the cost of living. They betrayed the working class by pretending that economics no longer mattered. They betrayed the American voter who tunes in expecting honest answers and instead hears complex academic jargon designed to hide the fact that the money simply is not there. The American voters who watched that television broadcast paid the bill. They pay the bill every time a politician values a viral social media moment over a real-world job. They pay the bill at the gas pump, at the grocery store, and in their drained savings accounts. The representative from New York walked out of the Senate building that afternoon. The black SUV at the curb was waiting to take her back to her office. But there is no road in the United States of America today that takes a sitting member of Congress home from a hearing where her entire economic philosophy has just been dismantled by a man with a pocket calculator. On a Tuesday morning, the country saw the numbers. The country saw the reality of the lost jobs. The country saw the reality of the Met Gala. The country watched a political icon refuse to answer whether the math actually added up. If you made it this far, you just heard the morning a veteran senator from the Deep South sat across from the most famous progressive in modern American history and read her own record back to her. From a yellow legal pad, in his own handwriting, he read the reality of her policies. The representative refused to answer the final question. Her hands shook. She fell silent. The country watched. Smash that like button if you believe a yellow notepad and common sense still beat a cable news appearance. Subscribe if you want to see what happens to the rest of the political establishment when the American people finally start asking to see the receipts. Comment math is math if you think the simple question of how we pay for it just became the most devastating force in American politics. Share this with the hardworking American in your life. The country is waiting, and the math is the math.